Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel, everybody. This is, part of our weekly updates here on the channel. Just before we get started, please do press that subscribe button because we are always here all through the week to give you the most important injury information. But yeah, before we get started as well, Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm not bad. It was a strange Saturday. 3 Premier League fixtures. Almost flipped over to the Sunday where it was pretty busy and a lot of key injury updates, hasten to add. But of course, we're heading into another weekend where we only have 4 Premier League fixtures, which kick off on Friday night. So again, a fairly condensed slate, and then the international break. And then really it's the business end of the season, the run-in. So when all the, when people start to get a little bit of squeaky bum time.
Well, this is one of the things that people should pay attention to the channel and also to the Premier Injuries website as well. We do our kind of yearly investigation into when teams have nothing to play for. And I think for FPL managers, it is essential, and also for bettors on the Premier League as well. There's some really anomalous results because one of the great phrases that you say, Ben, is players are already on the beach. They've got their flip-flops on and they're not really too motivated towards the end of the season. One last thing, though, before we get on to the analysis. I mean, we do have to talk a little bit about that Newcastle result. Absolutely horrendous that the penalty was not given to the Magpies, was it?
Unbelievable, mate. I mean, VAR was brought in to eradicate, those types of decisions where maybe the referee, didn't see it for whatever reason, or it was maybe too much of a close call. It just brings that impartial viewpoint where even not to recommend the referee go and take a second look at that. I mean, what exactly do you have to do? Right, the Dan Burn, the elbow. You could argue that maybe, again, that's fairly subjective. Intent is the key there. I mean, you question, a guy like Dan Burn, what is he, 6'7"? He's jumping. So you're talking about you need to have that arm in and around that maybe 7 to 8 foot off the ground. I know Kai Havertz isn't the type of player that necessarily you would associate having that nasty streak, but do you know what? For me, almost that arm is in an unnatural position. It wasn't exactly as if he was using it as leverage on Name's shoulder. It was right up there. But look, I can see why that wasn't given. But the Jacob Murphy one it's an absolute disgrace. And we might get an apology from the referee. We might. Who gives a toss? What does that? Had we not been on that, 9-match unbeaten run, I think we were, that's ended. If we hadn't have been that and we had really been down the bottom and scrapping, then potentially, that decision there could, and it still could have. I mean, we're not out the mire by any stretch of the imagination, but potentially the implications of that one decision could boil down to hundreds of millions of pounds. Absolute joke.
Yeah. Totally agree, Ben, and both decisions that you talked about as well, just it seems to indicate quite often that the bigger teams get these decisions. But anyway, let's move to the injury news. That's what the people are here for. And so let's start it off. Should we go alphabetically? I think one of the big things at Arsenal is Takahiro Tomiyasu's ever-changing situation. It was one calf injury, then it's another. Is he expected to be back for this big Liverpool match?
Yeah, I don't even, the problem itself, I don't think is too serious. We spoke about a player who was still adapting to the rigours of the Premier League. Since his arrival at the club, if I recall correctly, I think there was only one outfield player who had played more minutes than him during that period, and eventually that took its toll. And like you say, he had that calf injury, and then he suffered another calf problem in training. Mikel Arteta's in a good place at the moment, and while Cedric Soares may not be the first choice and may not be everybody's cup of tea, he's getting a job done. Arsenal are getting results, and that eases the pressure somewhat. like I say, that means that Mikel Arteta doesn't really have to take any chances, doesn't need to take any risks. We know that Tomiyasu is going to be lacking that sharpness and that match fitness. And ultimately, when the games are spaced as they are, lots of recovery time, then inherently, Mikel Arteta doesn't have to have his hand forced. And I think for the moment, it makes sense, certainly, that Cedric Soares is nailed in that right back spot. And Tomiyasu can effectively, come back when he's good and ready. And that may be, after the international break, he may get some minutes for his country during that period, build a little bit of sharpness, get that base level of fitness, because it's not about returning for the odd game, which he did against Liverpool. It's about returning to the matchday squad and then remaining in the squad for that season running.
Yeah, that's the big problem there is, if you come back a bit too early, you can risk injury. And so let's move it to Aston Villa then. I think the big news is the Lucas Digne situation, but there's a few others there that may pique interest as well.
Yeah, the Lucas Digne one, of course, bad news from my FPL team, forced off fairly early in Sunday's game. Now, Stephen Gerrard has been sent for imaging, so we're waiting to learn the extent of that problem. What we'd say is, will he play before the international break? I mean, at this moment in time, you would have to say no, even at the minor end, that grade 1, or even if it was just a little bit of tightness and he came off as a precaution, you would have to question, whether Stephen Gerrard wants to potentially risk Lucas Digne for that next game and potentially exacerbate the problem, especially when he's got other options in there. So at the minute, I think there's major question marks whether Digne will play in Gameweek 30.
And looking at that Villa back line then, there was questions about Ezri Konsa, whether he was coming back as well. But then Callum Chambers came off with a bit of an injury as well. So tactically, if Konsa and Chambers are out, there could be problems for the team. But it does seem that Konsa is back in the fold now.
Yeah, absolutely. He returned from COVID, and had it not been for those couple of wins, and particularly that goal by Callum Chambers, that effectively is kept Ezri Konsa on the bench. But that would be a leg-for-leg swap. And what I would say about the Callum Chambers incident, he is a player that I would expect to be fit and available. Stephen Gerrard spoke about it was a similar scenario to what Douglas Luiz had suffered, an arm to the face, bit of a cut in the mouth, and maybe a laceration. Certainly not to the extent of Douglas Luiz, by the way, who is likely to require surgery for a fairly deep cut. Now, it has been stitched, but like Stephen Gerrard said, it's just been, patched up to get him through. And the fact that he probably will need some plastic surgery to remedy that gives you a little bit of an insight into the extent of the arm, the boot, that he took to the face. So that was a nasty one. Will he be available for Gameweek 30? Time will tell. Like I say, that will come down to the extent of the problem and what actually needs to be done.
Now, one player that a team will be wanting back because of their poor defensive performances is Brighton. Adam Webster, will he be back for after the international break? That's kind of what has been said about him. And I think Brighton are really in desperate need of him to be in that back line. 5 losses on the bounce now.
Yeah, I mean, it looks at this point in time that it's going to be after the international break. It was a fairly sort of mild or minor groin strain that he suffered initially, and he was on the cusp of a return to the team. He was involved in training. Unfortunately, he suffered a setback. Now, initially, again, it was thought out as going to be fairly minor. Now, Graham Potter said that he's only got an outside chance for midweek, and like I say, it could be that we're looking at after the international break for Adam Webster, which, given their current run, I think it's 5 straight losses now, they're going to want him back sooner rather than later.
Let's move to another defensive team that are in need of a return here. It's Burnley. Ben Mee, I mean, he's a big loss to the side there.
Yeah, it was. So initially, Sean Dyche said it was an impact injury, knee. Didn't think it was too serious. In fact, I think he picked it up against Chelsea, forced off early in that game. Thought he would have made game week 29. However, subsequent imaging revealed a hairline fracture of the fibula. as it were. Now, fortunately, in terms, the grand scheme of things, it's a non-weight bearing bone. It's certainly not like a hairline fracture of the tib. So therefore, recovery is a lot swifter. And we would expect him ordinarily, looking at the data, and from what in and around maybe that, but I'm going to say 4 would be a bit of a push, but certainly from maybe 5, 6 or 7 weeks is realistic. We have seen returns in around that 30-day mark. So that gives, that's going to be a push for that first game back after the international break. Now, the issue that Burnley have got here is also now is the dismissal of Nathan Collins, who will now serve a 1-match ban. So that does leave them a little bit light in defence as it currently stands. So I wouldn't say he's categorically ruled out of that game in game week 31, but certainly at the moment, and everything that we've heard from Sean Dyche in the data would indicate that, it's probably likely that we're looking beyond game week 31.
And Burnley certainly need it because, they're in that relegation battle. They do have 3 doubles to play, which might pique some FPL people's interest. But the interesting for them, amongst the kind of relegation threatened team, they have the worst performance amongst those intra-relegation games. They sit rock bottom, that they can't seem to beat the teams that they need to around them. And so Ben Mee and maybe Nathan Collins just need to be in that side because they're really struggling at the moment. Let's move it on to Chelsea though, and I think the interesting thing with them is the Reece James situation. A big worry there for a lot of fantasy Premier League players who brought him in last game week. They had a massive haul and then he's gone and got injured. So what's the latest with him? Should these players carry on having him in their side or should they be transferring him out?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a concern when you're coming back off a fairly long-term hamstring problem. He suffered that setback. The first thing that springs to mind is going to be a recurrence. Thomas Tuchel said it isn't. It is a slightly different muscular problem. He hasn't given any kind of definitive timeline or any indication of a time frame. I thought it was always a bit of a stretch from return before the break. We'll see how he recovers during that time. Given the amount of games that he has missed, like I say, he's going to be a player that they won't want to rush back. Inherently, the Chelsea squad is in a fairly decent place. I know Cesar Azpilicueta was out of the game last weekend, but that was more illness related and stomach cramps. So he is, he can slot in on that right-hand side. We also seen Chabaloa, who can play in there as well. So again, there's no need necessarily to rush Reece James back. We'll see how things progress over that international break, but it's certainly not something that I see keeping him out for too long, certainly not to the extent of what that hamstring injury did anyway.
Does it worry you at all because it's his other leg, or is it just like one of those compensatory injuries that happens after you've been out for a while?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. Like I say, the concern when you're returning off the back of a long-term injury is playing 3 games in quick succession, which Reece James did. Granted, he wasn't 90 minutes in each one, but he was still involved. So there was an element of fatigue in there. And, I always bang the drum. We talk about a return to train. We talk about a return to play, but we also talk about how, in terms of intensity and the levels of the Premier League, are different to anything. And you cannot replicate that in behind closed doors games, in bounce matches, under 23s. You can only get that level of sharpness and fitness from actually playing in the Premier League. And it has been a little bit unfortunate, but, it's part and parcel of the game. I'm sure Reece will come back, well and strong and finish the season. And hopefully, given what's happening off the field, see Chelsea through to a decent finish to the year.
Let's move it to the Toffees, Everton, and big news there is Calvert-Lewin has COVID-19. Is that correct, Ben?
Yeah, illness. So yeah, that's unfortunate. Season's been a bit of a write-off overall, I think, for Dominic Calvert-Lewin. He came into the season off the back of a very disappointing Euros. In fact, you could argue that he was fairly deconditioned. We spoke about people involved in international tournaments and who are not playing regular football. They're not getting a lot of training in their legs. So while his teammates were, working hard on that pre-season training program, he missed all of that, returned late. Then he had the toe problem. Then he had the first setback, and then that quadriceps strain, and he had a couple of setbacks from that. I think ultimately that was in and around sort of 4 months. And he's just been picking up. He had an adductor issue, another knock, and this is just the latest in a long line. And what it does, it just means that, you know, Calvert-Lewin hasn't been able to get that level of fitness and that sharpness back just from getting minutes on the pitch, and that's stopping him. So when he does return again, like I say, it doesn't have to be a lengthy absence. It's just this culmination and this succession of injury and illness that's, you know, effectively he's going to write off his season, because, you know, even during this period that he has been back, you know, he hasn't looked the player that we're used to seeing, certainly not on top of his game. And, you know, he could be talking 5, 6, maybe even 7 games to play himself back in. And, you know, by then, that's it. You know, the season's over.
Yeah, that's the thing. And Everton need him back as soon as possible. Let's move it to their other kind of relegation rivals at Leeds. And there's, you know, a plethora of injuries still at the club there. They lost Junior Firpo recently, and he's a big loss at the back for a defensive side that, you know, just seems to be letting in too many goals. But the big one is probably Calvin Phillips. Is there any update there? Because he is the metronome in the midfield for that side.
I mean, we heard for many times on many occasions from Marcelo Bielsa, spoke about the Liam Cooper and Calvin Phillips on very similar timelines, obviously both recovering from hamstring problems. Now, it was hoped that they would be back in and around early March. As we've seen, you know, that hasn't happened. And in fact, it's Liam Cooper who's slightly ahead of Calvin Phillips. Liam Cooper was back on training normally with the group from last week. Calvin Phillips will hopefully join this week. Now, we have heard from Jesse Marsh on occasions reference both players, and he's going to be targeting that international break to get some real sort of good work in their legs, and hopefully, like I say, get them ready for the run-in. Because, you know, when you've had players who've been out for, you know, an extended period of time, what you need to make sure is, like I say, you protect them, and you don't want them to suffer any kind of setbacks, particularly because it was hamstring related.
Nuclear Atoms has actually asked the question, maybe bring it back, just interrupting because we are going through alphabetically, but he's asked, there are no red flags on Saka, but I'm hearing people say that he's had a knock. Is there any truth to that, Ben?
Always difficult. I mean, like I say, there's knocks and there's injuries, and we've seen Saka, who's been dogged by fatigue-related issues in recent games, a touch of cramp, works very hard. This whole Arsenal team is working and pushing themselves very hard. So, you know, knocks in are part and parcel of the game. As it currently stands, and my understanding is, you know, that it's nothing serious, it's nothing to be too concerned about. However, the caveat with that is, and what I say with every, you know, player post-match, you know, you've got to wait 24 to 48 hours to make sure that those players can be fully assessed. Injuries can evolve. Good example that I like to use maybe from this season was Heung-min Son for Tottenham. I think he completed the game on a Wednesday night. He was absolutely fine. Went to training on the Thursday, felt all right towards the end of the session, thought, actually, there's a bit of a problem there for the hamstring. And he had actually suffered what amounted to be a grade 2 tear for Tottenham on that Wednesday night. So that just goes to show, you know, in the heat of the battle, when the adrenaline's pumping, you know, injuries don't always present. And, you know, the extent of which the lines can be a little bit blurred with regards to that. So, like I say, as it stands, I don't think it's anything to worry about with Saka, but, you know, players will come back in the Arsenal players will come back in on Tuesday. They will meet with the medical department, discuss things, hopefully go through that recovery strategy, get ready for their next match. And as it stands, I think Saka will be absolutely fine.
Now, Saka was playing Leicester at the weekend, and again, they're a team that have quite a few injuries, but they've also got quite a lot of interest from the FPL community, from the betting community, because they have a fairly nice run into the end of what has been a very torrid season for them. Ben, what's the kind of injury updates there? Is there going to be any massive boost for the side for this all-important run-in?
Well, we hope so. Fingers crossed. I think inherently Brendan Rodgers will look on needs to bolster that back line, conceding far too many goals. One, you're missing that defensive reliability that in Johnny Evans, somebody who can control that back line. He should be in and around a return after the international break, but slightly ahead of him in terms of where he is in his fitness, and he's been slightly delayed because of COVID, is Wesley Fofana. Now, Leicester play the second leg of their Europa Conference League tie against Rennes on Thursday night. Wesley Fofana could be involved in that match day squad. Like I say, it's probably just a little bit too soon in terms of maybe starting for such a big game. A 2-0 first leg, it's still balanced on a knife edge, that one, so it could go either way. And we've spoken about COVID and its impact, and that's probably held Wesley Fofana back a little bit. Not only did he test positive, but it also means that the Foxes have been unable to get as many maybe practice or bounce games arranged to get him sort of, play himself back in.
One of the big ones in the Leicester backline is also Johnny Evans. He had about a 6-week rule out at the start of February. Is he close to any return?
Yeah, I think after the international break would be, the best guess with Johnny Evans, although we can never be 100% sure. When we're talking about initial timelines, and clubs and coaches and managers are, a little bit reluctant to give any kind of definitive time frame because, it's such a long and winding road and there's so many influencing factors. But providing that rehab has went smoothly and there hasn't been anything major in terms of a setback, early to mid-April is more than realistic.
And the big one, the big dog for the Foxes is Jamie Vardy. Is he going to be coming back soon?
Highly unlikely before the break. I'd be very surprised with that sort of initial timeline. Was maybe at a push, 3 weeks. I think, like I said, it probably makes more sense, given the fact as well that he's coming off the back of his own hamstring problem, just to delay any return, make sure he's fine, and be back for game week 31.
Now, the big injury news of this game week, I think probably the biggest in the world because he's the best player in the world, Mo Salah. I mean, what is the update there? There's so many people worried. He's people's captains this game week. What is the latest on him?
Yeah, I mean, the latest is that Mo Salah has not been part of it. We can tell we're live there because the door's just getting slammed by the kids there, if that came through. So, yeah, on the Mo Salah update as well. Yeah, so Mo hasn't been involved in training as of Monday. What we know is basically it was a problem that's been initially sort of played down or even dismissed by the player himself. We're used to seeing Mo Salah week in, week out. It doesn't matter how many games in that Liverpool side. He's a player who is very robust, rarely picks up injuries. He tolerates the demands. The bloke is a physical beast in terms of getting out there. So the fact that, he sat down, he was uncomfortable, he did come off, is a slight concern here. And I think that was duly noted by Jurgen Klopp. Forget what Mo says. He said it's nothing serious. If, when he sits on the ground and he cannot continue, then maybe there's a little bit more to that as well. So at the moment, we're at that evaluation stage, still being assessed. Fingers crossed it's not too serious. The international break comes at a great time, so even if he does maybe, just miss the 1 or possibly 2 games, then, great, he could potentially have 2+ weeks to recover.
I mean, but the big heartbreak for FPL fans is, are you saying that he probably won't be at that Arsenal match then?
I'm never going to pick, and I'm never going to give a definitive answer on that. Absolutely not. But not on a big call on this. What I would say is, and this is where there's lots of other factors. Injury, return to play are never black and white decisions. It never comes down to whether a player is fit or not. Yes, it's part of the decision process. But also, you look at that Liverpool front line, you've got your Sadio Mane's, you've got your Roberto Firmino's back now, you've got Diaz, you've got Diego Jota. Everybody's vying for a place in that front line. Now, it comes down to that decision. does Jurgen Klopp believe and have faith in any of those other 4 strikers? Are they pushing? I've never mentioned Divock Origi, by the way, but does he believe in those players? Do the players feel that they should be in that starting 11? And if somebody isn't 100%, and you've got players who are, chomping at the bit to come in on the sidelines, to come in and prove themselves, then sometimes, there's a little bit of squad management there and other considerations that come, like I say, could just help make that decision for Jurgen Klopp. And yes, it's a big game against Arsenal. And yes, Mo Salah, more often than not, will be in that starting 11. But if there is even, the smallest piece of doubt in Jurgen Klopp's mind, then I'm sure the likelihood is that he'll go with a different, an alternative front 3.
I'm just laughing at a comment there from Nuclear Atoms. He said, this Mo Salah update has kind of stung me. I thought it wasn't a major issue since everyone was saying it was just precautionary for him getting subbed off. But at least we're all in this together.
Yeah, look, it's very difficult. And when you're reviewing video footage, you kind of take a lot from that. Different injuries affect different players. And again, another example I would always use was the Theo Walcott, a player who was taken off, I think it was in a North London derby, smiling, having a little bit of banter with the crowd. 9 months on the sideline there. So, I'm not suggesting that, but you cannot read too much into it. Like I say, the fact that he didn't train on Monday, again, tells me that, he may be an early doubt for that game, and maybe Jurgen Klopp won't want to take any risks.
And this is why I say to people, subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure to pay attention to Ben's Twitter feed, because he will give the most accurate and up-to-date information. Because like we've discussed here, there's rumours, there's misinformation out there in the community, but we won't be doing any of that. Now, a few people in the comments have asked about Cancelo's illness. Will he start tonight? Is he going to be back?
Well, in terms of a start, we're talking Pep Guardiola here, aren't we? So, roll the dice, shake your magic 8-ball. Your guess is as good as mine. Cancelo, if he was anywhere near fully fit, would always be in my starting 11. What I can tell you is City had a day off on their Friday. The squad reconvened on Saturday, and both Juan Cancelo and Nathan Ake were both training normally with the group.
Somebody has asked for a Dinnery update. We did do that a little bit early in the video, so just wind back right to the start. We're going through this alphabetically, so if you hear Ben talking about a Brighton player, then just go back a bit further. If he's talking about an Arsenal player, just a little bit further on. So let's move the attention to, I guess, Manchester United. Bruno Fernandes is one of the big worries that people have questions about. It's about COVID, this one, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it was. So what we do know is Bruno Fernandes has actually rejoined the squad on Monday. So we've heard from Ralph Rangnick ahead of their Champions League tie against Atletico on Tuesday. And basically the only doubt or the only slight concern is over Luke Shaw. He was another COVID absentee in recent games. He submitted a negative test and rejoined the squad on Sunday. So mainly the question mark just comes about, is he ready in terms of that sharpness, fitness? Otherwise, the likes of Bruno Fernandes, who missed out at the weekend, Scott McTominay with a calf problem, they're both fine and available for selection.
So with that situation as well there, with the Fernandes one, with any sort of COVID illness, injury, we always do say, though, that they might not immediately be back because they might be kind of given, as you'd say, the kid gloves treatment, just because of how they might react to the virus. Let's move the attention to your boys. We started off the show with Newcastle discussions, but there's plenty of injuries there as well. But is there any injury updates that people in the community need to know? Perhaps maybe Joe Willock?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's good that people are asking questions about Newcastle players on my timeline. It seems like it hasn't happened very often this season, but I think that's indicative of their recent upturn in form and certainly some of those performances. And yeah, Joe Willock is one of those that people seem to be asking a lot of questions about. Joe Willock, along with John Joe Shelby, 2 late withdrawals from the Newcastle squad. Both of those players ended up being ill on Saturday evening, which forced Eddie Howe into a quick turnaround in tactics and to change things up. What we would say at this point is they're not ruled out of Thursday night's game at Goodison Park. Both of those players are in with a chance, but unlike an injury where you can maybe plot out that recovery, that evolution of the injury, illness is slightly different. Players respond in different ways. What we need to see, really, we need to see the likes of maybe Joe Willock or John Joe Shelby certainly back on the training pitches by Wednesday at the very latest to be, in contention for a place in that starting 11. If there aren't, then like I say, I think maybe there'll be big question marks on whether they could, but that doesn't necessarily rule them out of a place in the matchday squad.
Now, Newcastle are a very exciting team now since Eddie Howe has kind of seen this overhaul. And one of the people that the fantasy community, betting community, just people in general who follow the Premier League, their eyes are all on Alan Saint-Maximin. He did have a short run out in that game against Chelsea. He wasn't able to make a difference. But do you see him having his minutes managed over the next coming game weeks, or is he now back and solid into that team?
Yeah, I still think he's a little bit short. I mean, if you look at, over the last month, he's trained very little, the French winger. Initial problem came from a calf issue. I think he picked that up against Aston Villa. Several kicks was referenced by Eddie Howe in and around that calf. He spent a week in Monaco on intensive treatment. We covered it with that hyperbaric oxygen chamber to try and expedite that return to play. He was included in the matchday squad recently, but that was just after one session, and then he missed the following subsequent game due to illness. So again, that's impacted and probably had a little bit of a knock-on effect. So are we seeing Saint-Maximin at 100% at the moment? Certainly not. For my money, I think he's more of an impact player from the bench, given the fact that he's just below, his best. Give him a couple of weeks over the international break. And again, from game week 31 onwards, hopefully, he'll finish the season really strong.
Southampton are another team that have a lot of attention. They had a good run, and then they've had a couple of difficult fixtures recently. But Tino Livramento and Armando Broja are two of probably the most highly owned players in FPL from that team. They've had mixed injury news, but will they be back soon?
Yeah, I mean, the Tino Livramento one, it was something that I did touch upon on a previous video. While there was no injury as such, it's more that Ralph Hasenhüttl is managing the player following his recent knee problem, ongoing issues with the cartilage and meniscus. So something that may need to be addressed in a later time, and problems with quick turnarounds between games. But also when you've got Kyle Walker-Peters fully fit and also Roman Peru, then, he does have options. So he does have that luxury of being able to take Livramento out of the fire line and rest accordingly. So in terms of him being okay, he could potentially return to the squad. That won't be a problem. Armando Broja came on as a sub on Sunday, and then subsequently, I think, picked up a bit of a heavy knock in that collision with Ben Foster. I think his withdrawal again was more of a precautionary measure, but like I say, will be assessed fully over the next maybe sort of 24 hours, and hopefully nothing too serious with that.
And the opposition in that game was Watford, as you've mentioned there. Any updates on Ismail Sarr? I think he's the one that a lot of people in the FPL community wanted to do well in this team. He's not so far shone this season, but he could be an important player towards that all-important relegation battle that the team have towards the end of the season. Referencing once again that we will be uploading and doing some articles on when teams have something to play for, when relegation teams have something to play for. Somebody like Sarr may be a star and shine. So is he going to be back?
Yeah, I'm targeting after the break as well. Roy Hodgson said it was always going to be, a push to get him involved in any of those three fixtures last week. He suffered that minor setback, hamstring problem at Old Trafford. And it wasn't to be totally unexpected, given the fact that he only returned from that medial collateral knee ligament damage that he suffered against Manchester United. I think it was back in November. Of course, he recovered and he did play some part in the African Cup of Nations. So that's minor setback. But like I say, the international break and also the FA Cup weekend for Watford comes at a good time. It gives them an opportunity to, to put some real nice work in, down at the training ground, get their rehab done, and they're not missing any league fixtures. So hopefully game week 31 potentially for Ismail Sarr.
And just talking of the international break there, Nuclear Atoms has asked, is Brojo transfer out at the moment, or do you think he'll be fine by the international break is over?
Look, yeah, I'm just seeing this one as a bit of a knock, more of a precautionary withdrawal. Haven't heard a great deal, to be honest, post-match. Always difficult, like I say, when those games are on a Sunday and players won't have been fully assessed, maybe sent for imaging if required. But from my understanding, as it currently stands, it was more of just an impact with Ben Foster. And, as such, I would fully expect him to return, certainly after the international break.
Fellow London club West Ham. I mean, the list here is quite worrying for a team that they don't have the biggest squad. They don't have a lot of squad depth, and they're going in with European fixtures as well here. I mean, Antonio and Cresswell are ones from the weekend, but Bowen is also one that a lot in the FPL community have owned. What's the kind of updates from there?
Yeah, so the Jared Bowen one has been a slight concern. I think we were recording live when Bowen suffered that. I was on the receiving end of a tackle. The video footage wasn't great. We weren't sure if it was a non-contact Achilles heel or whether it was an impact in, I think it was Robertson caught him. We've since learned that it looks as if Robertson did actually catch him on that ankle, which is, in terms of what it potentially could have been, and looking at the discomfort that he was in, and he was non-weight bearing, and the decision was made fairly quickly to take him off. It looks as if it's, certainly on the lesser side in terms of severity, very painful, heavy bruising, but you understand that maybe there's an outside chance that he could return on Thursday. And like I say, it is only a small chance, but like I say, in the grand scheme of things, that's a potentially, that's great news, because that suggests he isn't too far away. And my initial thoughts were maybe it was, like I say, that Achilles problem, which would have been bad news. With regards to Mikel Antonio, what we know at this point is it's certainly not hamstring, because during the game, I think a player went over at Melly's Declan Rice, sort of went, oh, what's wrong? And if you're ready, he went, it's not hamstring, but it's thigh related. So, he's been assessed. Again, imaging required. And with Aaron Cresswell, that looks to be an ankle issue. Now, David Moyes himself said post-match, he said, even if we did know, if we had evaluated those players, I won't be telling you, because we're not giving anything away ahead of our Europa League tie on Thursday evening.
Very cheeky there from David Moyes. And I guess the final club in the Premier League is Wolverhampton Wanderers, but I don't think there's too much there apart from maybe a Semedo update. Is that likely at all?
Bruno Lage spoke about the initial injury, and he said, we're aiming for around about 4 weeks. However, my understanding is that initial timeline could easily be extended closer to maybe 6 or possibly even 8, which puts it in and around maybe mid to late April. We'll wait and see on that one. We will have another update from Bruno Lage this week. I think Wolves play Leeds. And he said what we'll do is we'll probably have something more definitive by then. There have had a couple of questions with regards to Hee-Chan Wang. He was forced off early on Sunday. That looks a recurrence, or I say recurrence. He has been managing an ongoing problematic back issue, keeps on going into a spasm. That may be related to the hamstring problem that kept him out for a fairly lengthy spell on the sidelines in and around 2 months. So that's something just to be aware of. Again, nothing too serious, but again, it can flare up on occasions. However, looking at that bench and the likes of Daniel Pedence that come in, I don't really see it impacting massively on Wolves. but just those managers who are maybe, owners for one, just to be aware of.
And I think one last question, unless anybody else has one, but we're about to wrap up here. Nuclear Atoms says, I was surprised that Fraser was benched this week. Is he still fighting through his injury? I still have him in my team.
This comes down to, I think, just ultimately what has been a little bit of a stop-start season for Ryan Fraser. He's been magnificent in recent games, but that's required a lot of effort. So a lot of these absences and a lot of them being forced off is just being fatigue related. So that a lot of muscle fatigue in there. Yes, he's picked up a couple of knocks. So inherently, this is more of just player management and squad management from Eddie Howe. Like I say, he doesn't want to risk maybe losing Ryan Fraser for, too long, certainly for the run-in. So maybe by managing him in these games and just giving him the odd minute, then that gives him an opportunity to refresh, recuperate, and Ryan Fraser certainly a player that could be back in that starting 11 against Everton.
Well, I think that is everything then done for today. And yeah, I've just quickly gone through the questions there, Ben. So you've got to shoot off. I don't know what you're up to today. Probably some Superman, awesome stuff as per usual. But just before everybody goes, please do leave a like on the video. Do share it because that helps grow the channel. And of course, hit that subscribe button as well because we're the best place for impartial, the most accurate injury information in FPL or betting or however you interact with the Premier League. But for now, I'm going to wish you the best of luck and we will see